Right, go ahead and get us started, and we'll go from there.
Does this
Yay.
on?
I feel disheveled.
You can't hear me?
I'm on. I'm fine. Are yours on? It should have a green light.
Have a green light. It's because I said that we might sing, and it was like, you're not singing. Smart microphone.
Is the channel?
Testing. 1, 2, 3, 4.
No.
I can just be loud. I can project.
Or we can just trade the microphone.
My mother would tell you that I always project.
Is there a different channel for that one? Well, this may be a more interesting conversation than I'd originally envisioned. And I can already tell that we forgot to turn off the door buzzer. So while you're trying to figure that out, I'm going to turn off the buzzer.
Hello. There we go.
All right, PK, you know how to turn the buzzer off, right?
I got
'Cause
you.
I heard it.
Yeah.
Okay. Hey, Paul. Oh, you're all fluffy. Somebody gave you a bath. Whoa. All right. Oh, I'm glad this is an informal production. Thank you all for being so patient. I can tell you the Christmas cacti are ready to go at the Botanical Garden. If you have nothing else to do after this, you should rush out there and grab one because they're spectacular. Right. You ready? Not quite. There's always this pause while I do Facebook. I know it. I should come up with a routine. Well, you're the one who off, so feel free.
I was Sandy in Greece once. It was the worst experience of my life.
Really? I can imagine that. Yeah. Pat's record for turning on the is somewhat weak. Well, why don't we just start? And if we tune in, people who are going to watch it remotely can watch it remotely. Too bad. So, good afternoon. Well, I mean, I don't know what else to do, right? Exactly. We don't want to make you wait. So, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for turning out. Ah, there he is. Start over again. Thank you, virtual audience. Thank you, live audience, for coming. This is really wonderful. We haven't seen Tasha live at the pen for since what, 2019? Yeah.
Still? No. See? It doesn't.
Just speak up.
I'll just be.
All right. I'll give.
This is my first in-person event since the before time.
Yay. Now to.
Immunity right now.
I love that. And by the way, since it's only me that writes the e-news and I can't often see my mistakes, Andrew will be here at 7:00 tomorrow, not 5:00, because I put in 2 times by accident, but that's the way it goes. Anyway, with Tasha and her final appearance as our 2022 writer in residence is Sulari Gentle here from Australia, who has just at the Botanical Gardens touring with me discovered the boojum tree. Do any of you know the history of the boojum? It's an Australian tree that the Desert Botanical Garden, it looks like a giant parsnip upside down with a kind of flag, and it's popped in the garden. So for ages, there was like one boojum tree, and now there are various boojum trees all over. So I really recommend them if you go. They're quite funny. Were you surprised?
I was surprised. I've never seen a boojum tree. So I presume they're a desert plant, and I live in the mountains. But yeah, they're interesting. They're invasive. Like everywhere, there was Australians in the botanical garden. So, but they're quite interesting, aren't they? There's another tree that I expect you'll get in the Desert Botanical Gardens. It's called the baobab tree, and it's a big fat bottle of a tree that will eventually come to you. But it takes 1,000 years to turn into a bottle. And then sometimes the native people would hollow it out and there would be shelter inside. It was amazing.
I'm not sure that the garden is there to save Australian arbory, but interestingly enough, the Phoenix Zoo, saved the Arabian oryx. I don't know if you know that, but the breeding program for the Arabian oryx was actually at the Phoenix Zoo, and now they've sent them back to. I mean, not all of them, but enough of them back. Sort of like the Bronx Zoo saved the buffalo. The same thing. So the botanical garden here, I think, is engaged in saving the boojum tree, but I don't know if they're going to go for other species. But we're actually here to talk about Egypt. So there we go. And it's Lady Emily and Colin, and is this their 16th adventure? So as we know, Colin has an interesting and totally undefined role in British foreign and diplomatic history. And we followed them through many countries. I was reciting to Solari all the places that we have been with Lady Emily, which include Pompeii, Vienna, Greece. Now, was it Santorini? Yep. And various other places. So it's always fun to read Tasha's books and go to different places and go to them as a Victorian tourist. So anyway, I love that. So I'm going to hand the microphone over to Solari, and when we get to going down the Nile, I'll come back.
Thank you. Okay, so it's been my honour to read Tasha's book and be introduced to Emily and Colin. I'm a huge Agatha Christie tragic, so this is really down my line. So welcome.
Lovely to be here. Good to see some familiar faces.
So 16th book. So you and Emily are soul sisters now?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that was the only thing
Take that, and I can shout.
Okay.
Yeah, I every once in a while, I can only, first of all, the really embarrassing thing is that you said is it the 15th. It's the only reason I can remember it's the 16th is because I was doing an interview and the person interviewing me said, oh, this is the Sweet 16. So that's the only, because, you don't, when you start writing, well, first of all, you don't even know it's going to be a series. You desperately hope it will be, but you don't know. So you can't fathom it going on this long. So I feel really, really lucky and honored and privileged that you guys are still here reading these books.
Can I, because I'm new to the books, can I just take you back to the beginning where Emily and Colin emerged? And it wasn't Emily and Colin originally, was it? Emily was a widow.
That's right. She was a widow. It's the only way you can be a young Victorian woman and do anything interesting. So, and who among us hasn't thought it would have been a good idea to have a first husband who would die and settle irrevocably upon you an enormous fortune? Right? I've played my cards very badly in real life, though. I mean, well not now, but no, but Andrew's my second husband. He's safe. Yeah, the fortune. I'm looking for your fortune too, but sorry.
Yeah. So we'll go back to the beginning with Emily. Could you just give, mainly for me because I'm new to the series, where did Emily emerge from? What was your inspiration? When I read the series, I was reminded of Tommy and Tuppence. Especially in that wonderful, loving relationship that you have between Emily and Colin. But is that what you were looking for at the time? Were Tommy and Tuppence even on your radar? Were you?
I wasn't consciously thinking about them, but now that you say it, I can see that. I had a very strong visual image of someone I did not then know was Emily. Yeah. I just got this random image of a young woman in a Victorian dress standing on the cliff path in Santorini, looking over the caldera. And it was such a strong image that I wrote it down. I wrote kind of the first paragraph of the first book, not because the plot stuff wasn't there, but just a bit of it. Yeah. And then I put that away. Because I had a baby. You can't write when you have a baby. Or you can never write, right?
That's what you desperately want to write when you have a baby.
Of course you do. Of course you do. So I put it away for, I guess, like 2 or 3 years. I don't remember honestly, and then pulled it back out when I had decided that I really needed to sit down and start writing, because I had been saying forever that I wanted to be a writer. And if you're going to keep saying that, at some point you actually have to do it. And of course my son he was 3.5 and stopped napping forever 2 weeks before I started writing.
Yeah.
Of course, that's what they do. They know. And I was just casting around thinking, well, okay, so I'm going to write a book. What am I going to write? And I dug out this folder. It was a miracle I even found it with that paragraph in it. And so that was kind of, because when I looked at the paragraph again, I thought, well, okay, wait, who is this? How is a young Victorian woman on Greece by herself? And she's, so it was really just asking questions of myself about that image that brought me to the character.
So 16 years on, how has your relationship with Emily changed?
She, I don't know. I'm not sure it has changed. We've always gotten along well most of the time. Sometimes she does things that I think I wouldn't have done, but that's fair. Your friends do that sometimes. I wanted her over the course of the series to grow up.
Yeah.
But not to change. I don't want her to be fundamentally different.
Yeah.
So there's that fine balance between, I just know that myself as a reader, I love long series.
Yeah.
And what you want is each year to open that new book and think, I'm back with my old friends, right?
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, you don't want it to be exactly the same thing over and over and over again. This is where Andrew and his brother always say, you have to write the same thing, only different this time. But I wanted Emily to have an arc of character development that went beyond a single novel, that went through the series. So she's certainly, I think she's matured a bit. She's still very impetuous, but she's self-aware. She knows she's being impetuous, and it's kind of more that she's choosing it actively instead of just
impulsively doing it. Yeah. Well, that makes sense. As I said, one of the things that really captured me about the book was the relationship between Emily and Colin, which is lovely. They're an old married couple, really. They've got 8-year-old twins. 8-year-old twins at this stage. So they've been married for a fair while, but they do carry on like newlyweds, which is just charming. And that's so counter to the tradition of the crime fiction hero being lonely and bitter and did you set out to do that intentionally?
I did. Yeah. I did, because there were several factors pulling into it. One, I just thought, why is it the books always have to have some brooding misery, will they, won't they, going on forever? And it's like sometimes it's fun, but sometimes it drives me crazy. So I thought, well, it would also be a challenge.
Okay.
What if you just want this couple to be happily married and that the drama of the novel isn't actually, spoiler, the book next year, they're in the whole time.
Oh, which is lovely. That's something to look forward to.
or not, depending how you feel about 9-year-old boys. Especially Henry.
So let's get to this actual structure of this book. This is an unusual structure, though Barbara tells me that you have done this before, where it's a dual storyline. So it's not only Emily and Colin's story, but alternately we see the story of Merit. Is that how we say it? And Merit is a young woman in the year 2.
Well, she's in, so the ancient Egyptians dated their calendars based on the year of the pharaoh's reign.
Okay.
So it's the second year of Ramses II's reign.
Okay. Which is, translate to?
I don't remember. Do you remember? What would that be? He's
middle or later dynasty. Ramses II is the pharaoh, I think I have this right, that lived into his 90s.
Yeah.
He had many wives and many children. He was an incredible builder.
Yeah, the great builder. Yeah.
And I'm trying to remember.
Is he maybe like 1800 BC? I can't remember. I should remember.
A couple of thousand years BC.
He was among the most powerful of all the pharaohs, and certainly.
I think he was around the same time as Troy.
Was the second longest reigning monarch. I had to ask myself if the one they're really thinking about who was the first line. It might be Ramses the
It
second.
could be because
Yeah.
he was in, I think he died at 91 or
Well,
something.
and I've seen his mummy, and the thing that really gets me, I really admire him for it. He had impacted wisdom teeth because you see it in his mummy. And I thought, honestly, this man lived, for decades with like the worst dental. You wondered, boy, they were tough.
Yeah.
I mean, really tough. Yeah.
Well, that's the problem about fantasizing about time travel, right? The dentists.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm always aware when I write in the 30s that was before deodorant. And, and my characters are always showering.
That's true. They do have a very high hygiene. I hadn't really thought about it.
It's because
But now,
yeah, I'm constantly aware there's no deodorant, no, and they're all wearing wool suits in an Australian summer. So, and I suppose that's what Lady Emily and Colin are facing on the Nile.
Well, there are a lot of baths going on.
Yeah. So the second storyline. Let's talk about that. So that's Merritt, and she's a young woman. She's a sculptor, and her story is her. There's a separate mystery running through with her, which eventually connects back. So, do you want to talk about where you found Merritt, or how she?
Sure. Yeah. So Merritt actually. So I have been, as I think many of us are. I got obsessed with Egypt when I was a little girl and went to see the King Tut exhibit at the Field Museum in Chicago. My parents took me, and the golden mask and all that, and I just was so captivated by that, and always have been interested in Egypt. So before I started writing, I was living in New Haven, and I decided. I mean, these are the ridiculous things I do. So I have a 2-year-old. So I decided that I'm going to study Middle Egyptian at Yale because that's what you do when you have a 2-year-old and no babysitter. But in the course of learning, I just thought it would be neat to learn how to read hieroglyphs, really. And in the course of studying that, you learn the alphabet, you start learning how to translate, you learn the grammar. A lot of the most wonderful primary sources that we have from ancient Egypt come from a place called Deir el-Medina. That's what we call it now. Pademi was what the people who lived there in the ancient times called it. It was a village that was purpose-built by the pharaohs right next to the Valley of the Kings, and it was where the artisans who built the tombs lived with their families. So you have this village that is exclusively interesting, really creative, artistic people. And they all live there and they work on the tombs. And it's been a treasure trove for archaeologists. There are loads of papyrus scrolls that have been found there. And so stuff about daily life in ancient Egypt, I would say it's probably really the only source for primary sources, people's letters, wills, records of the lawsuits, all kinds of fascinating things, poetry. And so when I was studying Egyptian, a lot of the things that we were translating were things that had been found there. Okay. And so I just always had kind of in the back of my brain that what an interesting place to live that must have been, right? Because the pharaoh's going to have the best artists in the world, right? Or at least in Egypt, which is what he would view the world as anyway. But what an interesting environment, right? Because the people who were kind of like service people, they didn't live in the village. Only the artists, they were outside of the walls. Only the artisans lived there. They had to bring them in water every day because there was no well. They had to bring food in for them, but that was part of their pay. So I thought, especially because, of course, I wanted to have a female protagonist in the ancient story. And, that is tricky at different periods. Well, at all periods of history, right? But I thought, well, if you are the daughter of one of these artisans, you can't tell me that these women weren't cultured and talented too, right? So I thought that it gave me the opportunity to have a woman doing something, but also doing something kind of outside of the normal scope of Egyptian art, because, you know, Egyptian art, it's so really regulated almost. I don't know, you know, it's very stylized. There were specific ways you made people look, how you did, you know, skin and the way the composition was. But since Merit isn't working for the pharaoh, she can just sculpt whatever she wants, however she wants. And so it was really kind of the perfect place to put her.
The Merit's voice was really interesting. It had a sort of wonderful formality that was really reminiscent of that sort of ancient times. And it's sort of, I thought it was reminiscent of when someone translates hieroglyphs. And the kind of poetry and language and structure that's used. Did you do that intentionally, or is it just?
I did. I was trying to, because that's always such a tricky thing with the past. You want to signal that these people weren't speaking like we speak, and of course we have no idea what they sounded like. We don't really know what Middle Egyptian. They didn't write vowels, so the convention is to just put short e sounds between consonants and say the word, but we don't really know what it sounded like. But I think you want, as a reader, certainly, I like to feel like I'm in that time without it being so cumbersome and difficult to read that you just get tripped up and it's like a chore.
Yeah. We had that conversation about Scottish Gaelic sort of languages, so where it becomes a chore to read, maybe authentic, but it becomes very difficult to read if it's actually depicted in the way that it was.
Well, I think that's one of the things with historical fiction. You want it to be authentic, but at the same time, sometimes it's too authentic and then people don't believe it.
Yeah, because you're speaking to an audience of today, not an audience of Merit's time or the Ramesses period. So the Merit's narrative it's a little bit like a Mean Girls sort of scenario going on. Do you want to talk a little? I'm sort of cognizant of not spoiling anything.
It's hard.
Yeah. So, but tell us a little bit about Sanura and Beck and how they feature into that story.
Yeah, so Merit is a twin, and she's got a twin brother who's ever so slightly older than her, and hence eternally wiser. And, you know, they are very, very, very close, as twins generally are. But now, at this period of time in Egypt, a young woman would get married way younger than a man. So Merit is already married and has a wonderful husband, but her brother is only now just getting married. And she doesn't like the girl. She's kind of one of these, like, beautiful people who think she's better than everyone. And, you know, we all hate them.
But she is really mean.
But she's really mean. She's really just a mean. She is mean.
Yeah.
She is mean. And so when her family or her brother or even her friends are saying, you got to give this girl a chance, she is married to your brother, other people aren't seeing quite how mean she is.
Yeah. And that creates a kind of a tension that plays into the ultimate resolution, about which I will shut up.
And then a lot of stuff happens.
Yeah, and a lot of stuff happens. So, writing historical fictions, so your entire career has been a historical fiction series?
So far, yeah, it has.
So what draws you to history as opposed to writing a contemporary piece or a...
Well, I will say once in a while, I just think, gosh, it would be so much easier to write contemporary. It'd be like kicking off a pair of 4-inch heels and not being able to, not having to think about, wait, could you use this word in 1892? Oh, no, not till 1897. But I think for me, I always felt like I was born in the wrong century, dentistry aside. I think when I was a little girl, it was really... Well, it was Little House on the Prairie to start. You know, I wanted to be a pioneer. I still want to be a pioneer. But I don't really want to steal anyone's land. So I guess that becomes awkward. That becomes awkward fast. So, but then, you know, then you start, as you get kind of more into the history, I can remember being 7 and I had this set of Godey's Ladies book paper dolls.
Yep.
Oh, those dresses. And I just thought, why can't I live in a time where I can wear those dresses? You know, I wasn't even
But
put...
you thought about the underwear.
Well, I was just gonna say, even the corset didn't put me off. The corsets didn't put me off. In fact, when I did a lot of theater in high school and college, and I was in many plays where I had to wear a corset. And you actually get used to it really fast, and you just always have perfect posture without trying. I mean, you can't really breathe, but I mean, hey. But so I was always just fascinated by the past, and one of the things that really drew me in about it was this thought that I always had that you can't ever really know what it was like. You can't. You can read all kinds of primary sources. You can, if you're looking at more recent past, you can talk to people who are alive then, but you're not going to know what it was like to walk down the street of Piccadilly in London in 1730. But I loved trying to think about that and trying to figure that out. And so I think that sort of spurred me on as a child. And I get, I think writers were primarily readers, right? And so that's what I read. I read history and I read historical fiction, and that's what I wanted to read. And so when I did start writing, that's what I wanted to write.
Yeah, it just seemed like the natural trends.
Yeah. And I think also historical fiction is a great way to shine a lens on the present, because I think people are more open to ideas sometimes when they feel like they're at arm's length. You're not saying, look how awful we're all being today. You're saying, oh, look how awful these terrible Victorians are being. Look familiar.
Yeah.
People are more willing to, with that step removed, I think, to look at things.
Yeah, they get out of their corners and start to look at the story. Yeah. So now this one takes place in the Nile. You had planned a trip to the Nile. What happened?
Well, I don't know if you've heard of this, but there was this disease. Yeah, no, Andrew and I had booked this amazing trip to go. We were going to cruise up the Nile and go to Deir el-Medina and go to the Valley of the Kings and go to Luxor. And we thought we had pushed it far enough that we could maybe go. But then Omicron happened, right? Yeah. Right. So it just, and I mean, I guess we felt like, one, it was kind of just reckless to do. And two, that was a time when it was still hard to get vaccines in a lot of the world. Yeah. And I sort of felt like, oh yeah, you need these Western people who are vaccinated waltzing through I don't know. It just seemed
crass.
It did seem crass. Yeah. So now I had to go back to that lifetime of thinking about Egypt and Barbara.
Sorry. Yeah, sure. Yep, this one instead of this one.
So it does sound like it's a wonderfully romantic thing to go down the Nile. I have done this 3 times, and what it really is a road trip, because Egypt has closed the Nile to navigation most of the way for tourists, because if you recall, there were terrorists that assassinated. I think it was a German group that was the one that was most seriously decimated. So if you land at Alexandria, if you've been in the Mediterranean, they drive you down to the Giza pyramids. Giza, where the pyramids are, is west of Cairo. Cairo is a city of probably now 25 million people, and it is impassable. So, and unfortunately, the airport is on the east side. So in your worst nightmare of like Los Angeles or Phoenix traffic, Cairo is going to be 10 times worse, and it will take you like half the day to get across. So anyway, you drive down, and you can sort of see the Nile from the road. The Delta, which is beautiful and looks like a lotus blossom, you can see some of that. Alexandria is a beach town. But anyway, they drive you down to Giza, and then you can go to the other things that are, I'm trying to remember, Saqqara, which is the other major tomb, and the step pyramids and so forth. I've actually never did go inside the big pyramid, but Dana and I, for authentic purposes for her research, we actually did descend, just the 2 of us with nobody else around. We climbed up to the top and then descended down the burial shaft into one of the tombs. I think it was the step tomb or something. And I will tell you this, that it's true if you're going down Mount Serenity, Going down is terrible. Going up is not too bad, but it's really hard to go down a very steep angle where you don't have anything much to hang on to. I kept thinking, we're going to be they're going to find us. These two strange, mummies in the bottom of this tomb. But anyway, that's how you get from Alexandria to Cairo. But if you go on what they claim is a Nile River trip, they fly you from Cairo to Luxor, and the only bit of the Nile you can go to on a ship is from Luxor to Aswan, which is basically a day and a half or a couple of days. The Aswan Dam prevents you from going further, but also the lower Nile below the Aswan Dam is now Lake Nasser. It's not really the river. So if you read Agatha Christie, Death on the Nile, she set sail from Aswan south towards the cataracts. You can't do that now. So what you can do is you can fly to Abu Simbel, or there are like little lake cruisers that you can take, but it's not a river trip, it's a lake trip. And eventually from Abu Simbel further south, I think the river kind of comes back in. And what's really going to screw it up is, I'm trying to remember which company, is Ethiopia, isn't it, has decided to dam one of the two rivers that make the Nile. There's the Blue Nile and the White Nile. And while I was there the last time, Sisi had a conference in Aswan with various African nations, and they were trying to figure out, like the Colorado River Compact is basically the same thing. What would happen if this dam in Ethiopia prevents the Nile waters from coming down like they normally do? The Aswan Dam has, in fact, prevented the silt, that annual renewal of land along the Nile forever. That's why Giza is on a plateau way above the level of Cairo, because the pyramids and all would have flooded. So they went west to build it on a mesa, so that the river at its highest, when it would have its winter, it couldn't flood the tombs, or it would have ruined it. So that's the problem. And the other problem is that the wildlife can't travel back and forth now. So the hippopotami are stuck up on one side and, can't come back down and so forth. The hippopotami were actually the instruments of execution in Pharaonic Egypt. Hippopotami are the most dangerous animal in Africa. They don't look it, but they could really move and just trample you to death. And the Egyptians used to actually basically throw people to the hippos. There's a lot that we think would be true if we took a Nile trip, but isn't. On the other hand, it's a fascinating country to go to. And what I did the last time was, instead of trying to work out going on the boat, we just drove. We had a car and a driver that took us from Aswan back to Luxor, and it was great. And we kept detouring down to the river and seeing the temples and, doing all that stuff. But it was actually easier than trying to do the ships. So if you look at some of the ships, what they basically are floating spas. And, you can be out there in the Nile and you can be in a hot tub, or you can, have a massage. But it's not. It's really not what you think is going to happen. I don't know if Egypt will eventually relax, because there's no real reason you can't board in Alexandria and go to Aswan. You can't clearly go past the Aswan Dam unless they blow it up, which wouldn't be a bad thing in a lot of ways. But, dams are a whole new subject that we could talk about. But there isn't any real navigation reason, why you couldn't travel up and down the Nile. But they're not going to overcome the rest of it. And also, if you are an American tourist in Egypt, you have to have an armed guard escort. You can't go to the night market. They won't, because they're so worried that something will happen to you. They don't want another international incident, because it, would be terrible for tourism along with everything else. But aside from all that, there are lots of Victorian relics, because you all know that Thomas Cook, basically in Victorian times, are what started the travel industry. So he brought people to Egypt because A, people with tuberculosis could live there better, and B, the climate in England sucked. Right, Andrew? So if you were in Birmingham in January, you'd think, wow, I just as soon be in Luxor. It'd be wonderful. And I've sent Tasha the pictures. The Winter Palace Hotel, which is the Victorian luxury hotel in Luxor, which is the city that, if you cross to the West Bank, is where all the Valley of the Tombs and the Valley of the Kings and the Valley of the Queens and the Temple of Hatshepsut and all the rest of it is. The corridors in that hotel are as wide as this bookstore. I have never been in a hotel that looked like that. And the reason is because the Victorian women had these enormous, their clothing was huge. And they always, because of that, they had to travel with serious trunks and maids and so forth. So they built this hotel on a scale where all of that could happen. And it feels so fascinating today to do it. Even the tea room, when you go into it, the spacing around it allows for these women, to be in their clothes. And so you have to ask yourself, how comfortable would it have been to be a tourist in Egypt if you were in 14 crinolines?
Not comfortable.
Right.
Not comfortable at all.
Right. So Tasha's book basically takes you to the Valley of the Kings and the Queens. So Luxor would have been where the temples there would have been where most of this is.
Yeah, I don't really have them cruising up the Nile because, that's on the Nile. That was done.
Well, they could have been cruising.
They could have been. Well, and they had cruised. They had cruised. So they arrive in Luxor in the beginning of the first chapter. But I wanted it to be that they were just stationed in Luxor. And I think, going back to what you're saying about the terrible English weather and the trunks that they would bring, right? I mean, you get these amazing stories about, the Victorians and the Edwardians were such amazing travelers, but they would go to Egypt and, they would essentially have Fortnum and Mason supply all of the food that they needed. And they would go into the Valley of the Kings with this army of servants carrying all of these Fortnum's hampers and champagne. And they'd either set up a tent or go into a tomb and have their picnic, with all the good things from home, but they didn't have the cold rain, so you can see why they were drawn to Egypt with the weather. And actually, when I was doing research, I came across this duke who he wintered in Egypt every year because his health wasn't great, but he had absolutely no interest in anything in Egypt. He wouldn't go in a tomb. He didn't look at a temple. He did not care. Never visited any of the sites. And there's a wonderful book, well, it's letters from, I think it's the physician that he had hired one year to come with him because he was so ill. He had to have a physician on hand all the time. Although it didn't seem like he was really that ill because from the letters you see like the doctor really wasn't doing anything. I think it was more of an affectation than anything, possibly. But the doctor is he's young and excited and he wants to go see all of the stuff. And the Duke's like, no, I'm good.
Oh.
Do you want to see the pyramid? No. Hey, there's a tomb. No. Hatshepsut? Nope. Wouldn't go anywhere.
Oh.
Just there for the weather.
So if we go back to the story, you can keep that just for now. If we go back to the story of Colin and Emily and their adventures on the Nile, do you want to talk to us a little bit about the mystery that's set up and the death of Lord Dealey?
Yeah. So actually, when I was, you figure out I always figure out where I want the book to be. Usually, I figure that out first, and then start thinking about story ideas. And because I wanted to do Egypt, the first thing I did was I thought, let's reread Death on the Nile, because I hadn't read it in a million years. And so I reread it. You just forget how good those books are. They're so good. So then I decided that I should just read all of the Poirot novels, which I did in rapid succession. And it was just the most fun. It was so wonderful. And when I was reading one of them, I'm not maybe because it's too much like work. I don't, when I read a mystery, try to figure it out. I want to just be carried along by the narrative and, But one of those Poirot books, I just had this, I was like, I think this is what happened. And I'm going to have to be cryptic or I ruin the whole plot. But I really thought that I knew what happened. I was completely wrong, of course. But when I got to the end, I thought, okay, I'm completely wrong, but that would kind of be a cool idea for a book. So that was so my wrong guess is the correct answer to what happens in this book, in this book. And then so I sort of had the idea of the plot, the kernel that I needed for that. But then I was trying to think about which of the because I've got a lot of secondary characters who've been in the different books, and I like to bring them back periodically. So I was thinking, who can I bring back? And we hadn't seen Colin's mother in a very long time. I think we haven't seen Colin's mother for probably 10 years or something. Well, she's a bit of, she's not as bad as Emily's mother, but, she's not easy. And so I thought, okay. And actually, my agent then said to me, what about Anne Hargraves? I said, well, I was thinking the same thing. Okay, so we'll bring Anne back. And so when it's embarrassing, but you write a long series and you just can't remember everything. You can't. So the first thing I needed to do was go back and say, okay, find every time I'd mentioned Colin's mother, what had I said about her? Where does she live? What does she look like? What's her story? What's she do? And the thing that I had completely forgotten about her was that when she's first introduced in the series, we learn that she had spent the better part of a decade traveling around as an unmarried woman. Her mother had died, and her father was eccentric and was happy for her to just travel. So that's what she did. She had no interest in getting married. But she went to Egypt, as of course she would, in the middle of the Victorian era. And at that point, you could climb the pyramids. Well, usually you would hire some guides who would essentially drag you up the pyramid. She's halfway up the Great Pyramid, and she meets Nicholas Hargraves, Colin's father, and they're engaged by the time they get back down on sand. And so I thought, well, my subconscious must have remembered that, because to have her back in Egypt, I was like, this is correct. This is what I should be writing.
Yeah.
So that was sort of how the little elements came
together.
And then you have the elements, and then the problem is you have to figure out how to make it a story that can be a book.
and enough suspects to make it viable.
Yeah, and with this, because I had gone through and read all those Poirots, I really just got so in the spirit of it. I just wanted the book to be an homage to Poirot. Yeah. And so there are a lot of little inside Poirot jokes, mainly from the books, but there is one TV reference.
Oh.
It's Cedric.
Oh.
Yeah. So there's a Nile crocodile that makes a brief appearance in the book who's called Cedric, of course. But that is because in the David Suchet series, I don't know if you remember, this isn't a crocodile, but Hastings is off in South America, of course, at some point, and he comes back with a stuffed caiman that he's brought as a gift to Poirot, who's utterly horrified because he does not want a dead caiman in his perfect apartment. But Hastings had named it Cedric. So, yeah. So I wanted the feel of the book to feel more kind of Agatha Christie Poirot.
Oh, it does definitely. Yeah, it jumps out at you in the beginning, and for we Christie tragics, it's just a delight to find, because the voice is really beautifully spot on without being a parody. Which is always the risk you take when you go to do a homage.
It is, because sometimes it's so hard to, if you don't get it just right. Yeah.
And interestingly, as much as I was engaged with Colin and Emily, I found myself being more and more drawn by Merritt's story. And, the temptation just to flick through to find out what happened. Was I didn't, but I was very good.
Which you could. There's no law that says you couldn't just read, them all. You could separate them out if you wanted to.
Yeah, but then you'd lose the lovely.
You would, and I think when you're writing books with the two timelines, I find this every time I do it. I'll have something in say the Emily storyline that I'm not really sure why it's there, and then 3 Merritt chapters later, I'll be like, oh, that is, pulling us into the Merritt story. It's all so intertwined. It's just the subconscious is a wonderful thing.
Yeah. So do I take from that you do plot or you don't plot?
Oh, I do not plot.
You're a pantser.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, if I wrote an outline, no one would want to read that book.
Okay.
It'd be like 1, go to Egypt. 2, arrive in Egypt.
Yeah.
It would be very boring. I feel like you can't. Well, for me, and the thing is with writing, you have to do what works for your brain. So you have to figure out what works for you, because what somebody else does is irrelevant. It only matters what works for you. And for me, I really think of it as when my son was little and I would sit on the porch and tell him stories. You don't get to write an outline. You just have to kind of, it was really good training ground. It makes you develop a sense where you can instinctively feel, okay, we need something to happen now. We haven't seen this character for a while, you know.
Yeah.
But I can't know what happens on page 206 if I haven't written up to page 205.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit more about your process. You're a pantser. Even for this sort of novel, did you write Merit's story separately and then splice them? So you
Nope.
You did it all.
Write it as you read it.
Okay. A beginning to end.
And then you do have moments of terror where I think, do these stories have anything to do with each other?
Yeah.
How are they going to come together in the end? And then one beautiful day,
Yeah.
you're like, oh, that's how they come together. Okay, good.
So your process otherwise, are you someone who sticks to a timetable, a word count, or do you just write when you feel like it, when you can?
For this book, I like to write in the morning. I like to write before I can be distracted by anything. So I generally brew a pot of tea, go to my office and start writing. And for this book, I would write 2,000 words a day.
Yep.
And stop that. Sometimes you feel like you can go on,
Yeah.
but I think it's better to give your brain that space
Yeah.
and a break to let it
Yeah.
percolate and do its subconscious magic.
Yeah.
But I when I'm in drafting mode, I mean, I will write pretty much every day. I don't want to take a day off because then you don't remember where you were.
Oh, yeah.
and-
It's amazing how quickly you forget what you've written.
Yeah. Yes.
And then there's extra work to go back and read it.
Yeah, and I do. I always read what I wrote the day before. That's the first thing I do, and just sort of lightly,
Edit it.
just do a light revision, and then move forward.
So once you get to the end of that process, do you then revise the entire manuscript, or is that what you send off the agent?
Well, what I'd like to do ideally is I get to the end of that first draft and I let it sit for like 2 months.
Right.
Longer if possible. And I don't look at it or think about it. I usually read and
Yeah.
go hiking and whatever. Work on something else, But I want to try to read it where there's enough space that it's almost like you're I mean, you can't ever read your own book for the first time, really, because you know what happened. You wrote it, But I like to try to get as much distance as I can so that I can sort of read it with fresh eyes.
Yeah, it's where that forgetting business works for you.
Yeah.
Rather than against
Yeah, because I think especially with a mystery, you need to get the suspense right. And sometimes when you're drafting, you know this is a clue.
Yep.
So you can't tell if you're being too heavy-handed or if you're being so. I was just talking to my editor a couple days ago about the next book, and there's one clue. He's like, "That's just way too subtle." And when I was writing it, I remember thinking, "God, this is so obvious. I'm gonna have to," but I couldn't tell because I knew. Yeah.
And then at that point you revise.
Yeah, then I revise. Well, actually, Andrew usually reads before I've revised it all. He reads the unvarnished horror, and then I revise and give it to my agent.
Okay, so he gives you comments feedback back on that.
Yep.
And your marriage has survived, so obviously it's
He's a very insightful reader.
okay.
We do the same thing.
I do the same thing. And in fact, it's probably been good for my marriage rather than.
Yeah. But no, I think because it's certainly very intimate.
Yeah.
I mean, you're so vulnerable giving someone your book to read.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
There's a wonderful line in a book by David Mitchell. Book's called Black Swan Green. It's about a little boy in the 80s in Britain who wants to be a poet, and he writes poetry, and he's given some poems to the editor of the Vicarage newsletter. And the line just says, so he just handed the poems to her, and he says, "When you give someone something you've written to read, you lie in your coffin, hand them a steak, and say, 'When you are ready.'"
Wow.
And I think that really is what it feels like, because you've poured your heart and soul into these pages, but you want someone. I know Andrew will tell me if it just absolutely sucks. You need somebody who will be honest with you, because you are not helping someone by blowing sunshine at that point.
Yeah. And then, I mean, Ethis, how does that process work for you? I know sometimes Michael gives me advice that's very insightful and useful, and sometimes he gives me totally ridiculous advice.
And you can tell the difference.
I think I can tell the difference.
Yeah, I mean, Andrew, I don't think I can't think of any. Have you ever told me something totally ridiculous? He often will say, "This is probably ridiculous, but I think this." But I don't think you ever have actually said anything that was just inane. I mean, sometimes we'll have things where I'll think something is more interesting than he thinks.
Yeah.
You know, kind of thing. But he's really good with plot.
Yeah.
So he's very good with noticing if there's a hole. He's a very thorough reader. He will notice if you've changed the way you're describing someone or something. Yeah, he's good. If I could clone him, we would all have that that fortune settled irrevocably upon us.
Oh, there you go.
You need a side gig when Reacher is quiet?
Yeah, no, I always find that Michael has some really insightful advice that's really good, but every now and then his personality takes over, and and he says things to me like, "This is a murder. You don't need this love stuff. Take it out."
Oh, what the love stuff?
So you've got to.
Wait, is this why you have the every book is a romance? In the moment.
Look, that isn't necessarily. I mean, my books aren't particularly.
in the book.
Yeah. But my books aren't particularly romantic. But if my husband had his way, there would be none of that. It's all about the murder.
I want to know. I want to know now in Woman in the Library if is it Leo is saying every book is a romance.
Yep.
Did that?
He just said it, you know.
Oh,
So,
yeah.
I mean, do your characters do that?
They just do stuff.
Yeah, sometimes they just say things and you think, oh, that's interesting. And you have no idea where it came
But see, I
from.
wonder if that's where it came from.
It could be. Yeah. Well,
Well, especially because he's not really right.
yeah, he's not really right.
See, there's a lot of genius going on there.
Yeah, exactly. So it could be. But, you know, sometimes, I mean, and you look for that, for your writers your characters to actually take on their own agency. So at what point did you know that Emily had her own will outside yours?
It was when I was writing the first book, and so she's this she's a widow of 2 years, so she's half out into society again, and she is having a dinner party at her house, and when it's time for the ladies to go to the sitting room for coffee, she says, "No, I am staying for port." And I remember, I can picture, I was in this literally garret apartment in New Haven, and I'm typing, and I'm thinking, oh, this is such a bad idea. What is she thinking? This is going to cause a lot of problems for me and for her.
Yeah.
But that was the moment, because I had never thought, oh, her thing will be that she drinks port.
Yep.
But her thing is that she drinks port.
And
She let me know that.
Why don't we go back to the plot for just a brief moment? Just for fun. Right.
I'll give you mine. So this one?
Sure. Yep.
Okay.
That'll be great. So when we talked about this is, some of the critics said this is as if Agatha Christie rewrote Death on the Nile. I was actually not being rude. I was looking, you can't see it from here, but this is what Agatha Christie would have seen out of her hotel room, looking because she's below the Aswan Dam. So this is the Nile floating, and I have a ton of photos. There are a lot of them on our Instagram. You don't have to belong to Instagram, but if you go to our Instagram and go back to December of 2019, the photos that I took of Egypt, including the one of me at the bottom of the tomb shaft, are there. And so you can see it. But, and we read Death on the Nile. We packed Death on the Nile, and I'm trying to remember which Elizabeth Peters book. And then we took turns reading them as we traveled. So it was very cool. We started in LAX at the airport and went on from there. But anyway, it's a bit like Elizabeth. So they are assembled thanks to Lord Dealey, Emily and Colin's family, and various friends of Lord Dealey have been invited to this beautiful place in a banquet, and the banquet, Lord Dealey dies. And it has to be poison. Now, you all know that Agatha Christie actually knew poisons because she worked in a pharmacy, or whatever the British term. What's the British term, Andrew? Is it It actually is pharmacy during the war. So she really knew poisons. She was great. As opposed to Dorothy Sayers, who in one of her famous novels, when somebody dies by mushroom poisoning, got the mushroom wrong.
Oh,
She did. She has the wrong, so
mushroom.
Agatha Christie and Ellis Peters also were, because they served in wartime pharmacological roles, they actually knew poisons. So Laura Dealey dies by poison, and it only a certain number of people could have done it, right? So it's that classic setup that Christie loved, the country house murder, the close circle, whatever. But what happens is you get to explore all of the relationships that Laura Dealey had leading up to this moment. And that's so your book is historical on two levels. We have Merritt's story, but you also have to go back and mine the whole life of Lord Dealey to figure out, what led to his death. So there's actually 3 whole story tracks in the book, if you think about it. Yeah. And I think you did it really well. And as in a really good mystery, what you think is true isn't necessarily true. So you have to get all the way to the end. Right. So I thought you did a wonderful job with it.
Thank you.
And she also did that with the Pompeii book. Do you remember that there was another story about a young woman in Pompeii who was, what did they find her?
Slave.
Yeah, but she was found in the ashes. I can't remember. But anyway, sort of a similar thing where the body was preserved because Pompeii also did that.
So is this a style you're going to continue for future books?
Yeah, because I guess I started doing it with a Venice book. I can't remember what number that was. And that was just, I don't know. I was going back to that. I'm like a broken record. I love reading books with 2 timelines, and you get 2 different time periods in history. And so I did that in the Venice book, and I just have gone deeper into that each time subsequently. Oh, and I have to say, this is something of a non sequitur, but you said Elizabeth Peters. Emily does see Amelia Peabody while she is in Egypt.
Yeah.
I didn't want to, I had to be very careful because I didn't want to put words in Amelia's mouth, but Emily is having tea with Howard Carter on a terrace, and a formidable British woman comes by, and so if you know it's Amelia, you know it's Amelia.
Barbara, I have a couple quick questions from YouTube. Hopefully. Liz would like to know, Tasha, and Solari, feel free to jump in with your books as well. Who are your favorite characters within your novels? And then she also wants to know if any more Lady Emily Christmas novels or novellas are going to reappear.
Okay, well, a favorite characters. Sorry. A favorite characters. That's. I mean, I love Emily. I have to love Emily and Colin. But it's like picking your favorite children. And
I like Henry.
Henry. I like Henry a lot. Henry is really
he only
fun.
has a really small part in this book, but I really like him.
But he gets the job done, doesn't
Yeah,
he?
I know.
That's
He's got a
Henry.
presence.
That's Henry. Yeah.
We have these, twin puppies, and it's so interesting to me that people bond with one or the other.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, I've always loved Jeremy. He's really, really fun to write, the Duke of Bainbridge. When Jeremy's in a book, it's just always easier to write because you could just write 500 pages of Jeremy being useless and witty. And of course, then there wouldn't be a plot, which would probably be a problem. But as for the Christmas novellas, I mean, I haven't really thought about it for a while. I probably should do another one at some point. They're harder than you would think, though. Have you had to do a novella a little? But they're not even really novellas. They're like long short stories. But you have to have all of the elements that go into a whole novel. Only it has to be really short. So it's actually quite hard.
Yeah.
So, but I would not be opposed to doing it again. Don't tell my editor that.
Also, somebody commented that you've been with your publisher really for the longest time, and that's really unusual for a writer. Usually you move publishers around. So what's that been like for you? What's it been like to be just a part of that
Yeah.
house?
Well, so the first 3 books in the series were with HarperCollins, and I really liked them. But when they offered the next contract, it was disappointing. And so it was very stressful because I let the option. So you have your contract, and there's an option clause in it. So you have your current publisher has a 30-day exclusive on the next book in the series. And so, we felt like we couldn't get to a financial place that we needed to get to. So we had to sit, and you can't show anybody else the manuscript for these 30 days. So we let the option expire, and that was, oh my God, that was so stressful. That was so stressful because you just think, what am I doing? Bird in the hand. I'm kicking the bird in the hand and praying there's another one in the bush. But fortunately there was, and I moved to Macmillan to Minotaur. And I love my editor. He's just wonderful, Charlie Spicer. He's a dream to work with. He's very insightful. He gives great notes, but he doesn't try to, he never wants to impose his vision on your vision. But at the same time, you'd be crazy not to listen to him. Because, and that's the thing with writing. I don't think it's ever good to write in a vacuum. You need people who didn't write the book to be able to look at it and read it and say, well, what about this? And have you thought of this? And I love that kind of that collaborative bit of it. And I think that's why, I adore Charlie. So yeah, we have done, that's a lot of books. Yeah. 13. Yeah. So we're working on the 14th one together right now. So, yeah, I think also it's, publishing can be frustrating, and we all wish we would sell more books. Well, except Andrew, who, sells all of the books. But, when you have a great relationship with an editor, that's really valuable. And also it's hard to move a series after 16 books.
Yeah.
That would be a hard sell anyway. And I don't know, you don't want to go to a new house and reinvent the wheel, really.
Exactly. And then you have a backlist that's with another publisher.
Yeah.
It's
Although I have to say, HarperCollins has been so good to my backlist. They
Yeah.
still are. They still run promos on my backlist.
Oh,
So
great.
they've been great. In the end, it wasn't an ugly divorce.
Oh, wonderful.
They're wonderful. I love them.
I have found the tea room at this is where Agatha Christie would have been. And I'll try to find my photos of the Luxor, the Winter Palace. Did you see this?
No,
These are great. And the chairs actually have, you can't really tell. I'll try. They're animals. So the arms, see the arm of the chair, they're monkeys. Which I think is very cool.
Yeah.
Yep. And can you see it?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, you can't see the chair. It's too small. I wish I had a screen so I could put it up there.
I want to thank my friend for bringing me into a new author. I'm very excited. And I'm interested to see that you studied medieval history, and I wonder if any of that shows up in the book.
Well, it does. Because let's see. Uneasy Lies the Crown has, I'm trying to think, I had 2 books with medieval. That one, the secondary storyline is is Henry V pre-Agincourt, and the story of how Colin's family came to have the beautiful estate that he has because of services done for Henry at Agincourt. And then that's also got in the Emily story a lot about the tower features in it. It's set in London, well, the Emily part. So that's got some medieval stuff going through it. I'm trying to think what other ones have medieval. Yeah, the Venice book, it's Renaissance really, which is not medieval, but yeah, I'm trying to remember if there's anybody else that's medieval. Uneasy Lies the Crown would be the most medieval. And thank you for coming.
Are there any other questions?
In that case, thank you all very much. I'll walk around so you can actually see it. This is the corridor. More space, but I think that's fascinating. Anyway, thank you all very much for coming. Tasha and Sulari both will be happy to sign books for you. And we're not actually allowed to sell Andrew's book today. In fact, it's lucky we can sell it tomorrow because